actually have a physical recorder of tape that you're spooling right now. My
I
God.
guess
All right.
Rocket Chat is over, Robert.
That Racket Chat is over. We're now segueing to a new show. So welcome to Off the Record. My name is Robert Barros. I'm the SVP of Innovation here at 352. We're an innovation and growth firm, and for the past 4 years, we've been connecting innovators here in the Atlanta area. And this is now our 7th Off the Record since we went virtual in a sort of current pandemic. I was going to say post-pandemic, but we're not quite post there in the current pandemic world. So we're really glad for you guys to join us this morning. With me is Scott Sanchez, Chief Innovation Officer of Nationwide Insurance. Scott, great to have you.
Thank you.
And so just before we get our conversation going, I just wanted to mention to everyone on the Zoom, go ahead and have everyone turn off their video now and go to speaker view at the top of your screen. And don't forget to mute yourself. We're going to be taking questions throughout the chat, or throughout the conversation this morning. So feel free to post them in the chat. Myself or Karen will take a look, and we'll try to work them into the conversation. And so start thinking about, what are some perhaps big questions you want to ask within the innovation space, given maybe the context of where we're in today. And obviously, you'll get some more ideas as we continue the conversation. So we're going to jump right in. And Scott, could you just give a bit of your role, give us a bit more context on the role of what you're trying to do at Nationwide, what the purpose is, and maybe talk about a little bit of how you got there today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. So I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for Nationwide. I'm actually the first Chief Innovation Officer for Nationwide. So a couple of years ago, as the board and the executive leadership team were talking, what they all realized is we weren't doing enough in innovation. Sure, there were fits and starts. Sure, there actually was a decent amount of innovation. It was just scattered and fragmented, like I think it is in most companies, if you will. And so just over 2.5 years ago, I joined a Nationwide as the Chief Innovation Officer. And my role there is really to drive innovation across the company. That means a couple things. It means in many ways we help the business units innovate on the things that they need to, on stuff that's closer in. But I also own innovation teams and own products that we launch that are a little bit further out. And so we get to sort of balance across short-term, medium, and long-term as we drive innovation across the company, and which also means it isn't just about having all innovation on my team. In many ways, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer, but I also think of myself as the Chief Innovator Officer. How do we bring innovative skills to everybody throughout the company, all 28, 29,000 folks, and help build up the skills in them? Now, I would also tell you, I never meant to be a Chief Innovation Officer. That wasn't sort of what I didn't even know that existed. But through some electrical engineering work, an MBA, and doing business, out to Silicon Valley for a decade or more doing product management, all of that led me to sort of a really a unique combination of sort of the business, the technology, and the customer or the user. And that really has come together to sort of form how I think about and I'm trying to drive innovation at Nationwide.
Awesome. For context, talk a little bit about, so a couple of years ago is obviously a very different time than today, but talk about a couple of years ago, what was the impetus for a Chief Innovation Officer or a broader look at innovation for Nationwide?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say there's, innovation can mean so many different things at different companies. And for us, it means delighting customers and solving their needs in ways they can't imagine. And so what that means is we took a very customer-driven approach to what we're trying to do. And again, everybody says we're customer-driven. The reality is there's a whole nother level of acting that way and being that way. For us, when we thought about that, how did Nationwide use that focus on the customer, which has been with us for almost 100 years? We're actually a mutual, so we're member-owned. But how do we translate that into growth for our company, right? How do we set ourselves up for the next 100 years? And so, specifically it was about how do we create, invent or reinvent new products, new offerings, and new businesses that can help set the stage for our growth. Because when we looked at our future, we actually turn 100 in 2026. Which seemed a lot further away a couple of years ago than it does now. But those centennial goals have said, let's create a whole nother set of growth for our company that can set the stage for us as we expand beyond just an insurance company, which is what most people know us as auto and home. But we actually have a lot of financial services, whether it's life insurance or annuities, 401ks and things like that. But how do we take a very diverse company already and make it even more diverse, solving more customer needs? That was really the impetus for doubling down on the innovation that we've done.
Appreciate all the context. I think it'd be helpful to maybe contrast a little bit, if you would humor me in this exercise. What were some of the initial challenges you faced when you were sort of spinning up this innovation practice, and maybe contrast that with today, which is we have a whole new set of challenges to deal with.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would say is a couple things. One, I started, and I would say the two biggest challenges I faced initially was number one, language. What the heck does that word innovation even mean? Right.
Hmm.
And so, it seems obvious, but when I went around and asked people, what do you mean by innovation? What do you think of when you hear innovation? I had to listen to that and then really set the stage for what we thought innovation was, which was what I rattled off a second ago, delighting customers and solving their needs. And so part of it was just getting clear on language. And it seems really obvious, right? It seems like everybody knows that. It seems like I could have come in and just built new products. The reality is there was a huge level setting that I had to do, which really led to the second thing, which is how do we engage people on my team and throughout the organization? I inherited 6 people. We're now at 150, right? And so it was interesting. And to your point, the challenges then seem both
Hmm.
a long way away, but also simpler, right? At that time, it was what's the right language, what's the right process, what's the right methodology, what's the foundation we want to build, and that's what we really went through the first couple years, sort of setting up. And now, if I think about the challenges, there are probably 3 that jump out. One is we've got 2 products in market. Spire, which is a platform for self-reliant millennials to get protection. We started with auto insurance in Texas, and we're growing that out. And Nimble, NIMBL, which is a way to help people get out and stay out of debt, right? Which is protecting their futures in some sense. And so that's one set of challenges is how do you actually take a business that you created based on customer needs, you prototyped, you built, right? And then you launched. What does that even look like? How do you start to evaluate that? Because you don't evaluate that with your typical revenues and number of customers acquired this early. How do you do that? That's one. I think the second big one is scale, right? It's one thing to run a small innovation team. It's a whole other thing to have 9 teams running at the same time, which is what we've got right now. We're headed towards 13 teams running at the same time, and each of those creates a portfolio. And funnily enough, the third challenge we are still working through is, again, how do we keep working with and through the organization? How do we bring people along? So in some sense, I guess that challenge hasn't changed. It's just gotten bigger because of the scale we're at.
Yeah, that's fair. So no big deal. I don't know if you've heard, but there's a couple of challenging things that are happening in the world right now, forcing us to not be in offices and obviously making some people feel incredibly uncomfortable, myself included, with the world as it stands right now. And you don't know when your sense of normalcy will come back. How has that affected what's going on for you guys? And I'm curious what else you've heard in the, we'll just call it the innovation ecosystem, about some of the other challenges that are out there.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think about the answer to that for me is really 2 different parts, and
Hmm.
we can unpack whichever one makes sense. One is just personal as a leadership, my own leadership style. That's been challenged. The other is how do we react to help our customers, help our teams, and help our communities, right? And so, from a personal perspective, there's no playbook for this, right? There's no, oh, last time we went through a pandemic, this is the things you did, right? There's no playbook for that. And so what I found myself doing as sort of this whole thing started to hit in early March is I didn't have past experience to draw from. The data that was coming out that we often look to make decisions on wasn't nearly there, right? And so my own decision making mechanism, if you will, starts with ears. I listen, goes to head, I try to analyze, and then goes to heart, right? Which is my gut. There wasn't any data that I could listen to. There weren't any people that had been through this before. There wasn't enough data. So what I found myself as a leader being is stripped back to just my core values, right? And that's sort of how I tried to figure out how to lead us through amazing people around me. But what we try to do is lead from a very people first approach. And so we actually nationwide was on the front edge of getting everybody to work from home. My team in about 3 days seamlessly transitioned to that. And so in many ways, it was trying to make sure that people were okay or good enough to be able to still progress the work. But it really was a people first, work second approach, which was a super challenging thing. And so in many ways, I felt challenged on so many dimensions to actually try to lead through this crazy time, not to mention, oh yeah, we've got to keep driving innovation at the company.
Hmm. Have you heard? I'm curious if you've heard about any other innovators who've been trying to navigate through this. There's obviously it's obviously a challenging time, and we've heard stories of people who just have to kill all their innovation initiatives. We've heard about people who they've doubled down, but obviously have less resources or funding. And I'm curious, anything you've heard that I don't know, just we would shed some more light on what else is happening in the innovation community.
Yeah, without a doubt. I feel like that I've heard the spectrum, right? I've definitely heard the pause all innovation, right, from other companies. And right now we've got to expense manage everything, and I get that. The reality is you're not going to save your way out of 2020. 2020 is going to be what it's going to be. But I get that without a doubt. I would tell you, for us, we are absolutely looking at expenses and being more mindful of expenses and, doing the right thing. We're not going to innovate in the old context. We've got to innovate in the new. But that doesn't necessarily mean cut back everything. In fact, what it means is let's really look at what are the set of things that we want to make sure to keep doing. Sure, what are the things we want to stop doing? So I've seen that, the expense side. I've seen as we have a venture fund where we invest, we're investing over $100 million in ventures. And I've seen some, as we've been advising them, some of those businesses are doubling down because their business is even more important today. Some of those businesses are quickly pivoting their business model, right? Without a doubt. Others are quickly pivoting everything about them. And so we're seeing sort of that change happen at the smaller level. And then what I find the most of people I've talked to is it's somewhere in between. Yeah, expenses are going to get tighter, right? But I think one of the things we've learned is that at the end of the day, the companies that are going to innovate enough during this time are going to come out better on the other end. I look at 2008 and the Great Recession. Remember, that was about the time Apple doubled down with the iPhone and the App Store, and we know what happened then. And so I actually find that companies are doing more of that balancing act. And I think that's the trick as an innovative leader. And honestly, it's always that balancing act. But how do you balance the long term with the short term? How do you balance innovating for the current context versus the new context? And so I think that ability for an innovation leader to balance things got even more important in this time. And I hope that innovation leaders and companies find that right balance for themselves. For Nationwide, what we're thinking a lot about is how do we innovate our way through this? And on the other end, this is a unique, once in a lifetime, once in a generation, at least once in a decade situation. In many ways, innovators look at things like that not as barriers, but as constraints and opportunities to innovate within. And I think that's what we as innovation leaders need to keep doing.
Awesome. Segueing a little bit maybe into the work, I'd be curious. So just to give a little bit of context for those who aren't aware on the line. So design thinking happens to be a pretty big framework and methodology that people use. Obviously in the innovation space, specific for Scott and his group, design thinking is a core component of what that looks like. So with that being a desirability-led practice, I'm curious, what have you guys observed in basically just trying to use empathy-driven interviews to better understand the pains that people are experiencing? Obviously, it's different pressures and sort of different factors now in the context of the world. Be curious if you're hearing or seeing anything that either A, is just rising to the top as an unmet need, or maybe it's even blurring what the needs are you guys are looking for today.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to go through this journey with our customers. We do design thinking and customer-driven innovation is the core of what we do. So we spend a lot of time doing research. We generally like for that research to be in context. So in the home, in the place of business, not via Zoom. And yet here we are on Zoom. I feel like every day, in fact, I was telling someone earlier, I feel like every day is Zoom day, right? I can't figure out if it's Monday or Thursday, but I know it's Zoom day.
So time no longer matters. It's
exactly
irrelevant, Scott. Yeah.
It's either Zoom day or weekend. I feel like
That's
there's
correct.
nothing in between. But I would say a couple of things. One of the things we're trying to figure out is by going on this journey, right, with customers during the last 30 days, we're learning a ton. One of the things we're learning is they don't know what's going to stick. They don't know what's going to be the future, right? There's so much uncertainty. It's so fluid right now that in many ways they don't actually understand and they can't project what it's going to be like. So what we're going to try to do is go with them longitudinally. And what that means is every month or so, we're going to check back in with certain customers and try to understand, because for an innovator, the trick is not just solving for right now, but it's solving for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from now. And so we know behavior's changing. We just don't know exactly which attitudes and behaviors are going to stick. We have some hypotheses. For example, we believe that there's going to be a lot around the home, right? People are spending so much time in their home right now. We're looking at the Google searches that are happening. We're talking to people and they're dreaming of more home things. Like that home is becoming even more of a sanctuary. And so one of the things we're thinking about is how do we protect the home even more? Not just insurance, but the life cycle of a home. You know, what happens when you rent? What happens when you look to buy? What happens when you have home repairs? What happens when you look to rent it out, when you sell it? Like, how do we think about that? So we think that's going to be a pattern that sticks. I think the other pattern we think is going to stick to some degree is, you know, I think people are going to think twice about a personal interaction, right? In the future, right? And so of course we're forced to right now, but I think people are also starting to realize that doing things remotely, whether on Zoom or on your app, is actually even better and more convenient. And so much of the value that's been created over the last handful of years with delivery and with curbside pickup and with, you know, order ahead stuff, we think that's going to stick. So imagine in the future, right, if anybody has used Teledoc or one of those services where you FaceTime with a doctor, we think that's going to get even more prevalent as people think about, okay, do I really need to go in for this? Actually, maybe not. And by the way, it's actually even more convenient if I don't go in at times, though of course, it's going to make those times that you're actually in person even more important. So we think about that a lot.
So in just in that vein of sort of the path of work today, I mean, how do you guys look at success metrics any different today than, we'll call it, 3 months ago? Are you guys sort of morphing what does success look like? Obviously, there's the bigger strategy and wanting to make sure you're fulfilling that. But to your point, 2020 kind of is what it is, and there's just sort of no undoing that. So curious how you've balanced that, if at all.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question. I would say that in some sense, I felt pretty good about our metrics, honestly, about all the aspects of what we've built. And in many ways, I don't think the fundamentals of that are going to change, right? So everything from, are you really solving customer needs? How many people are you actually talking to develop your prototypes? How many prototypes are you creating and iterating those things, right? No doubt eventually the more impact metrics like revenue and number of customers acquired. I don't think the fundamentals, if you will, of some of that is going to change. However, I think you've got to, I think the best innovators constantly look at those things and keep tweaking, right? And I think that's important. And I would say that this situation probably forces all of us to do a deeper dive on that, and I would encourage us to do that. However, I do think what we're trying to figure out is what are the macro trends and what are the small attitudes and behaviors that have changed? Because I think what we're finding is some of the things we're working on aren't going to be as relevant as we might have thought. Others are going to be much more relevant. And so what we're trying to do in many ways is fine tune or tweak those metrics so that we can keep dialing in even more what we're trying to do and make sure that all the work we do before we launch sets up our launches for success even more.
There's a great question in the chat. I want to surface up, and I might change it just a little bit, but it's in this vein. It's basically saying, how are you able to bring other executives or other areas of the business along so they understand the value of innovation? And I guess I might just morph it just slightly, just to say, you know, in this time, you know, the buy-in you might have to have from other senior leaders or other departments. Just curious what that looks like in this type of world for you, and obviously for other maybe younger innovators who are trying to figure out how do you get buy-in. What would you be saying to them, regardless of this time or other times?
Yeah, great. You know, so getting buy-in is critical for any innovation team or leader, and it's always been that way. When I started, it was critical. We got some things right, we got some things wrong, to be completely honest with you. But one of the things we called what we do is innovation through collaboration, right? So even that language around innovation through collaboration, that's what we talk about, I think set the right tone in general. During this time, I would say I found maybe 2 or 3 things that are critical. One was you got to listen even more. And so I've actually spent a lot more time just listening, asking questions, identifying, hey, can we help? Can we help there, et cetera. So I've been doing a lot more listening, I think is one. Secondly, I've been doing some sharing of here are some of the things we're learning, right? Without a doubt. And what I've found is leaders during this time, innovation leaders included, it's much less clear what the future holds than the path we were on. And I feel like there's a human insight there that everybody has, which is, I don't know what the path forward looks like. I probably didn't know before, but I sure as heck don't know now. And so in many ways, I think where innovation can come in is listening, is sharing some of the human-driven insights we're finding, but also finding areas where we can help, right? I've had conversations over the last handful of weeks where I've asked this question of, what are you thinking about? Right? What are the questions you've got? Where do you need help? And I think innovation can actually help on some of those fronts. Now, I still agree, I still believe it's a balancing act between helping the business units and doing what they need, but also preserving the longer term potential and the things that they wouldn't think about, or that things that cut across business units. But I think in many ways, I've doubled down on that effort to try to really figure out sort of what innovation through collaboration virus version feels like. And it's definitely an acceleration on several fronts. But again, I think that innovation can help lead the way through this.
Whoever just joined, love that I'm hearing a little bit of your conversation, but if you don't mind going on mute, that'd be fantastic.
Hey, Robert, just real quick, just do want to remind everyone, please go on mute. And also, if you haven't, open up the chat box so that we can see your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Scott, I was gonna probe a little bit deeper into the innovation through collaboration piece. You know, we often work with innovators who are, best way to characterize it would be they're struggling to make sure people understand what they do. And they're trying to make sure that throughout the organization, they're not just inventing a project to do, but a bit to your point, even today, in this COVID time period, you know, they're asking the business, you know, what are some of the challenges that exist? So it's not just generative and you know, it's only about sort of wild and crazy ideas. I guess I would just ask a bit about what is the type of energy and effort that's gone into education as it relates to helping make sure that these business units or other stakeholders get what you do, and maybe the second part of that is how often do you have to repeat that?
The number of times I've said innovation through collaboration and explained that is probably more than the number of Post-it notes we've used in 2.5 years, just to give you an idea. Right? No, but I would say it this way. You know, my philosophy has always been less about I'm going to tell you what I do, and it's more about I'm going to tell you how it can help, right? And so, you know, it's interesting because even aligning on that definition of the word innovation was key. But what I have found, and this is no fault of these other business unit leaders, they don't really care what you do, right? What they care about is what they do and what they have to do. And so in many ways, what I try to do is instead of educate them, I try to just show them, right? And actually what we'll do as an example, you know, a project we're working on right now is the business had some very specific questions that are critical around their current offering and their current product. And like many business units, they have these really great ideas that are going to change everything. And they want validation from customers that they're really great ideas. Well, we know how that goes. And so, you know, and so we took that and we took a project. We've got a couple going on right now that are sort of in this direction. And what we're going to give back is, one, here's how you can help your current business. Here are the things we learned that can help you accelerate your current business, whether it's better messaging, whether it's some tweaks to the product, whether it's some tweaks to the experience. We're going to give that back because that's what they need and ask for. But we're also going to give, and here's some bigger things you should be thinking about. Here are some ways to think about expanding or extending your business or even disrupting your business, because they don't really care how we do what we do. What they care about, and what they care about even more during this time, is they need help getting their current business in better shape. So I find that if I go to them and say, hey, we're innovation and we do design thinking, and I wave my hands a little bit and I show them some Post-it notes and all of that, and again, I paint an extreme, but you get the idea, that they're going to turn off and they're going to be like, yeah, fine. But if we actually say, great, those are your objectives, great, and we play back their objectives, great. Well, let's spin up a project to solve those objectives, great. And then we solve those objectives. but then we also apply our innovation lens to help them think about larger things. That's where I think we are best. I think of it more as show them what they need and then show them more. And that's really what we're trying to do as opposed to educate. And so it's a delicate balancing act, right? You talked about it. Man, I would tell you, I'm spending as much time talking with some of my teams about stakeholder management and bringing stakeholders along as I am about the concepts and the ideas and the learnings they've got, because we've got to walk that line and balance that and bring those stakeholders along. It takes an extraordinary amount of effort and energy, almost as much energy and effort as you apply to the innovation itself.
Yeah, I love the distinction of just show them as opposed to tell them. I think people get into that habit of the telling. I'd be curious to push a little bit more into the detail of, so when you talk about showing them and applying a design thinking lens and other sort of innovation lenses, would you mind just high leveling some of the frameworks that you guys are using in order to enable your teams as well as obviously other stakeholders to be, we'll just say, equipped to deal with these new types of challenges?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I would say, at the base, our framework is the ILITEs, right? And I won't profess to have come up with this myself. I stole it from IDEO, who probably stole it from others, but that intersection of desirability, feasibility, viability, right? That colors so much of what we do. What I have found, at most organizations, you come up with an idea, right? You create a business case and you go check with engineering to see if they can do it, and then you launch it. Right? And then, you read Lean Startup and you're like, okay, great. Now we're launched. Now let's see what customers actually like about it. Man, you just wasted a lot of energy and money, but hopefully not too much. For us, we are desirability led, right? So we spend so much of our energy using design thinking and human-centered design to try to unlock needs. We'll create prototypes, as you know, we put that in front of customers. Sometimes they're hand sketches of a mobile app or something like that. And then over time, we'll increase the fidelity. We are desirability led. But what we've also got to do is think about viability and feasibility. I would tell you, for me, feasibility is actually more important than viability, at least the way I think, because if there's a need, desirability, and if you can do it, feasibility, you can usually figure out a way to make money. However, that's not the way business units think, right? The way business units think is they've got their current frame and their current business, and they look at business cases of ideas. Right? And so what we're trying to do is not necessarily to change that. What we're trying to do is say, yep, we're looking at all the three ILITEs. We may not even say we are desirability led, but what we will do is we'll go out, do research, we'll talk to customers. Oftentimes we'll bring stakeholders along and they'll watch the interviews. I will say one of the benefits of Zoom, we can get a lot more people to observe an interview than we could in a home, right? Which is huge. And so then what we're trying to help them do is we're trying to add that desirability lens into their frame. And then we're trying to help them understand the possibilities of these things. And I think that gets us to a much better place than if I went in and say, hey, empathy, woohoo, let's do desirability only. You got to speak their language. In many ways, I would tell you we're good at it. We're not great at it. We got to keep working on it. It's going to be a constantly evolving thing. But again, they care about their business, not about what you're doing. They care about results, not about how you're going to do things. And if you can help them and then help them more, even on things they didn't ask for, that for me is what we're really trying to create.
That's great. A couple other comments and questions, and some of this is because we obviously work together, so I have a sense of obviously the frameworks and the talent inside of Nationwide who's doing innovation. I guess I would want to push on a question and just see where your thoughts are. How challenging is it? This is a softball, Scott. How challenging is it to, frankly, get people on board with so many new concepts, right? So, for example, you've got frameworks of design thinking. You've got obviously the practice of building new businesses and what is it like to think, quote unquote, in a lean way. We've got the technical challenges, the challenges of product management. Talk a bit about what it's like to, even if you have, quote unquote, people with the experience, what is it like to sort of stand up and onboard people into that type of organization? The scale of yours is much bigger than many innovators, and I'd just be curious for you to talk a bit about that, because I think it's a real challenge around the ensuring people have what they need to be successful, but there's just so many layers of what they need to be successful.
Yeah, I'll give you, it really is. And I'll give you a little bit of how that really came to life for me. So I'm on the faculty at the D School at Stanford where we teach design thinking. And we had a couple people who went to the D School a year or so before I got there, right? Which was interesting. And so I had the really interesting experience of, I knew the experience they went through a year plus. And then when I got on the ground, I was like, awesome, what have you done since then? Right, without a doubt. And what was interesting was so many of the elements they did bring forward, right, in terms of their learning there, but so many of the most important elements they didn't bring forward. And so here I am thinking, oh, this is a great thing. When we teach a class at Stanford, everybody loves it. And man, they go on and they do amazing things in the direction of this. What that told me is that these words that we use, design thinking, empathy, prototype, it's actually easier to do them the wrong way, if you will, than to do them the right way. And so what I would say is, what I usually advise companies to do is start small and build on success. Take one small project with 3 or 4 people and really work with that team to do it as right as you can, and then come up with something and earn the right to do more, right? And that's what I usually advise. I would tell you, when I got to Nationwide, I pitched that, and they said, nope, we want you to stand this thing up at scale. So I went from 6 people to 40 to, yeah, it was unbelievable. And the challenges that created were huge. But I don't think the learnings are unique to that scale. The learnings are, do it fast, do it quick, coach, right? Bring in the right experts to help coach you, right? If you can't do it, the reality is there's so many different ways to do this stuff. You know, go Google design thinking as an example. And I don't know, 10 years ago, you got 15 results, and now it's like 250 million, right? Or something like that. The problem is, what people get all excited about all these frameworks, all excited about the new language, all excited about this. The way I have to break it down for people is, at the end of the day, the way we approach what we do is 3 very simple things, right? Collaborative, right? Design thinking to me is collaborative. It's a team sport, right? It's collaborative. It's using empathy to understand people and uncover needs, right? So there's an empathetic need finding. And third, it's using prototypes to create concepts that could potentially solve those things. And so it's collaborative, empathetic, need finding, and creative problem solving and prototyping. And I'm saying that over and over and over. Now, there's so much nuance into all of that, that at the end of the day, I try not to change the fundamentals so much. I try to change the nuance around it to try to help teams coach. And I've brought in experts, right? We've partnered together. I've brought in other experts. And so I find myself trying to reinforce and coach all of those nuances, as opposed to change the fundamentals of what we're really trying to do.
No, it makes a ton of sense. One additional question for the chat I want to surface, is just very relevant, is, desirability. Here, I'll be cynical. Gosh, Scott, that sounds like a really hard thing to measure. And man, it sounds real squishy. And I can't imagine having to coach executives and business units on better understanding that. Help me understand, how do you measure desirability?
Right. So what we do is we scan all of our empathetic notes into a system, and the system spits out the most. I feel a little like Dead Poet Society when we talked about evaluating.
I like that.
Right.
That's good.
So I would say this: it is hard, right? I would say one of the fundamental things I have to bring people along on is their concept of data, right? Most people, when they want to quantify something, they look for the numbers, right? Without a doubt. Now I'll come back to a number in a second. They look for the numbers. The way to figure out these needs is not by the numbers. However, some of the same science that we apply in that can be applied. It's pattern recognition, right? It's looking at more than 8 interviews or 8 or 9 interviews of people in a given topic and looking for the patterns across. And then asking yourself a few simple questions, right? What's the most important need we saw? What's the most painful need we saw? And so in many ways, it's pattern recognition as you try to figure out the signal from the noise of what you saw. And so it's a different type of data, but that's a really important type of data that is there. And so in many ways, you're applying some of the same thing, though again, the answer doesn't just spit out and you're like, that's it. That's part of the uniqueness of innovation, is the answer isn't there. The answer is fuzzy. And so you've got to, through multiple iterations, bring clarity to that. That being said, I will say one of the metrics that I value a ton is the Net Promoter Score. And we have that into our products that are out there. We actually test Net Promoter even in our low fidelity prototyping, just to get a read. What I found about that question, right, on a scale of 0 to 10, would you recommend this to a friend or colleague, whatever the most relevant is, and they give you a number between 0 and 10, right? And then you ask them, why did you give it the rating? For some reason, that framing, whether it's in a research session or even more importantly, in a product where it pops up, it gives you an amazing indication of their belief in the product to solve a job, which is the need that you had from a desirability. So it's hard to do early, but I still do it early to try to get a read. That's the closest I've found to a numerical way to think about it. But the reality is we have to rely on our teams to do the work they do and trust them and hope that they followed the process right as we coach them along to actually unearth what the highest desirability opportunities are to go after.
Cool. That's great. I appreciate all the detail and unpacking of that. So I want to segue the last bit of time that we have this morning to really thinking about what would you do to innovate through this? And it doesn't mean, you have to pretend you're 3M, you have to pretend you're Budweiser, but it's more so, if you're an innovator today and you're trying to navigate through COVID, and regardless if you have we'll just say the right amount of resource to do it, what are some of the ways you would look at the world of what can I do now? And maybe even through the lens of what's maybe feels maybe near term or what feels more achievable than perhaps things that are a little further out. So just be curious to hear what are some of your thoughts and advice you'd give to maybe innovators who are struggling right now?
Yeah, the framework I've been trying to use, and again, I've had to make this up as I go in many ways, is the reality is you've got to, I believe, I'm trying to innovate across 3 different dimensions right now about innovating our way through. One is my team, one is my customers, right, or future customers, and the other is the community, right? If I just start with the community for a second, man, it's such a crazy time, right? That people don't know what's going to happen, right? Do I go back to work? Do I not? Do I wear a mask? Do I not? And so in many ways, our communities are struggling with so many of the same questions. And so one of the things we're trying to do, because 1, people aren't sure, and because 2, we want to keep sharpening our innovation skills, we've actually spun up a handful of innovation sprints in Columbus with a movement there called hashtag Can't Stop CBUS. And it's a group of organizations that are trying to help. So we ran an innovation sprint around a problem that may be familiar to many, which is how do parents teach kids during this time, right? It's a really hard problem. People forget the innovations that we're working on. How the heck do you balance teaching your kids when you're at home and they're at home, and yet you're supposed to do your job too, right? And so we did some of this stuff because our community needs us, and we can apply some of our innovation approach to that. Interestingly enough, one of the science museums there is actually going to go build one of the prototypes we created that we affectionately called Kids Teach Parents, right? And so in some sense, what we're trying to do is not just help ourselves, but help the community around us. That's important nationwide. I think that's important to innovators throughout the world who are engaged with their ecosystem. So how can you leverage your own skills to help and solve problems around you? We think that's a big part of it. That's sort of the community. On the people side, excuse me, for our folks, it's been a crazy 30, 45 days, right? We've learned all kinds of things about adult screen time. Right now, you're on screens all day. What does that look like? How do you move around? How do you, still collaborate? How do you run a big innovation phase gate meeting and actually be successful? Funnily enough, we've had 3 of our teams pass gates in the last 30 days, all remote, right, in some sense. And so, I think what we're trying to do is really gain empathy, not just for our customers, but our folks, right? Our people who are doing the work every day, and everything from how does a single parent balance having their kids to someone in your household having an immune disorder of some sort to I don't know where I should get groceries, right? And how should we do that, right? In some sense. And so, I think really understanding how you're enabling people. And I would say that, as much as we've been able to keep the work moving, what we've paid attention to probably even more in the first 30, 45 days is our people, because man, our innovators are people too. And we've tried to really focus on that. And so if we can get the community and and our employees understand them better, I think it creates the springboard for the customer piece. But we've really focused more on the employee and the community piece. And interesting enough, our customer piece is going on. But what we're trying to solve for is not just what are the needs right now, but where's the puck gonna be, and how do we sort of innovate our way through to the recovery and beyond.
Speaking of people, I mean, I know we're internally doing a lot of, the best way to call them is virtual events, just trying to gather the staff together and make sure people feel connected and try to have, quite frankly, just some good energy during a time like this. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you guys are doing with your teams today, whether it's sort of at aggregate or sort of within groups and clusters? Just curious to hear what you guys are trying to do and cultivate there.
Yeah, I mean, not a surprise. And just like we approach innovation, we approach this. We tried lots of things, right? Mm-hmm. We've done a virtual all hands with questions, which has been good. A bunch of our teams have done different happy hours in some sense. I tried something last week where we did a 2-hour for a group of people I work with when I'm in Columbus, which I haven't been able to be in Columbus since I live in Atlanta and I've been quarantined here. What we would do one night a month is go out and just talk work, talk everything. And so we've tried to recreate that. And so in some sense, what we're really trying to do is recreate some of that. But what's been interesting in that learning is that I think there's a positiveness between the blurring of work and home, right? There's a negative side too, without a doubt. When do you shut off the computer and all of that? But with kids showing up in Zoom, with pets showing up in Zoom, I will tell you, I don't know if you've heard, my dog was barking a few minutes ago, and my 5-year-old daughter opened the door to my office, and then I quickly heard her mom say, no, don't go in there, right? But I think with that blurring of the home and the work, there's a humanness to that. And I think in many ways, the way we're thinking about our folks is, in some ways, when they come to work, they put on their work face, right? But that's not necessarily who they really are. And so what I think we're finding, and one of the interesting insights we're trying to unlock, is how do we have their whole face, if you will, show up at work and home? And so we're trying to pick onto that and figure out ways that we can understand the whole self, right? And so we're asking questions. We had everybody get your pet and put them on Zoom, right, for a few minutes a week or so ago, right? And so what we're trying to do is almost double down on that human connection. And then especially as we start to think about returning to the office, how do we value that even more, right? People are wearing sweatpants, right? I'm not saying we're going to necessarily encourage sweatpants at the office, but you know what? How do we actually get the metaphorical sweatpants there, right? Because I do believe at the end of the day that the people who are comfortable in operating in their own conditions and situations are the best able to activate the creativity and the empathy that we need. And how do we actually do that? So we're trying to pay attention to that and leverage that through everything we're doing. I won't say, we've tried many things, like I think many folks on this video conference have tried. Some work, some don't. But I think the humanness is the thing that we're really trying to hold on to. And we want to make sure to pull that out even more and bring that back even more when we get back to the office.
I don't want metaphorical sweatpants to not be the best quote from this, but it's not the best quote, right? It was a lot of negatives there. Yeah, it's funny. We think a lot about, to your point, how do you continue to make everyone feel human and feel connected and feel like it's okay. We have some members on my team who've got kids, and they often show up on our Zoom calls, and it's okay, right? And I actually enjoy them being active members of the meeting. I think it's I think it's a really interesting and sort of sweet moment of where, to your point, like there's two halves or two parts of your life, and now they just have to be merged together. So I think it's a very real observation and very insightful. I think we've also talked a lot about, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. We've talked a lot about what does life look like when you're coming back. And so, for example, no one knows exactly, what is the date to come back per se, and no one knows to say, how do you do that? But, we think a lot about, does it mean that remote work becomes maybe a little bit more part of the culture? In other words, sure, we don't dissuade people from working from home. It's fine to do it. But we know there's some people who enjoy that, right? And I wonder what that looks like in the future in a world where we do want to have the right level of collaboration. So be curious to hear any thoughts that you have about, what does it look like when you're coming back, if you've been able to form some of those, because again, we don't know when it is, but we're having lots of conversations internally about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe two thoughts. One, as we think about coming back to work, I've sort of believed ever since this whole thing happened, I was amazed at the seamlessness with which people flipped to 100% work from home. It was easier than I expected. That isn't to say there haven't been problems, and some individuals and families have had some major issues, right? Without a doubt. I don't want to downplay that at all. But it was easier than I would have expected. I think coming back is going to be harder than we all expect, right? Forget all the unknowns, right? Data and what do you trust and what sources of truth and all of that sort of fun stuff. It's such a fluid environment. And yet this work thing is so personal, because guess what? You're going to go interact with people who aren't your family, and you're going to bring back whatever it is they have to your family. Again, we've got to all take certain precautions, right? In some sense. And so I think it's going to actually be harder to come back to work. And so in many ways, what we're trying to do is listen to people, have a people first, work second approach, and get back in appropriately. Yet we've got to be flexible and adaptable to everything we're doing. We're right now asking all the people on my team, share with us your concerns. How comfortable are you? Do you have a situation that might impact this? All of those things. We're trying to just do a people first approach to try to understand that. But I think the second thing that you teed up is a really good one around, is work from home going to become more important? And here's where I think innovators, whether you're at a company that is doubling down in a big way or you're still trying to get it started, this is where innovators, I think, have a really interesting dilemma. I fundamentally believe that the vast majority of innovation work is best done in person. I love the tools. I love online tools. There are all kinds of great ones out there, and they're getting better all the time. But there's nothing like being there in a room, on the board, post-it notes, drawing, whatever it is that's there. However, as we've looked at innovation, we actually think about it as different postures throughout the day. Sometimes a posture is everybody up at the whiteboard. Sometimes a posture is individually at your desk working on a computer. Sometimes a posture is someone giving a presentation. Sometimes a posture is a meeting. Right, there are all kinds of postures. What we tried to build in Columbus, the cooperative, is a purpose-built collaboration space that allows all of those postures all within the same day. I would argue work from home is just another posture, right? And it needs to fit within the context of all of these other postures as well. So do I think work from home will go up to some degree versus than after? Absolutely. Are we going to encourage work from home in some situations? Absolutely. But I think what we're actually finding is some of our teams are finding for certain things, it's actually more productive to be remote, right? And so I think it's more about, as an innovator, it's about the toolkit of how to use a work from home posture versus an in-person posture versus a work by yourself posture, and using that as yet another tool in your toolkit. I think that will be where the opportunities for innovation are, and that's what we're trying to figure out as we go through this.
Awesome. So I'm going to close it down with one more question here. And so I want you might remember, I use a version of this question every so often, but this question is, a younger, maybe more svelte soccer playing, Scott Sanchez, I don't know how many years ago that was, maybe 5 years ago. It's probably when you were in college.
Sure.
What would you share with that younger innovator from what you've learned today in how to be successful? If you could have given them some advice and would have known it, 20 years ago versus today, what advice would you give that person, especially for someone who's, again, kind of newer to the innovation community and just trying to figure out all of, frankly, the complexity of just being an innovator is hard enough. We live in extraordinary times, but I'd be curious, what advice would you give to them and sort of parting words to this?
I love this question. I would say two things come to mind. One, it's okay that you're not going to be on the World Cup soccer team. No, two things come to mind. I think one is when I went through sort of my quarter life crisis, if you will, right? I went to college, got a degree, like a third of my class went into management consulting. Then I went to business school, right? So that up till 25, 26, 27, I knew what that was going to be. But at 27 or 28, I'm like, what do I do now? Right? It was clear to me up to that point. And so I guess two things I would say to that person. One is, it's okay, right? The reality is you're going to be okay as long as you keep thinking not about what your long-term career is, but what's the next experience that you want to have, right? Because I couldn't really see past the next experience. So when I left business school, I knew I wanted to go to a customer-focused technology company, right? That was the only experience I could say. I couldn't even think about chief whatever, right? And so I wanted to get that customer-driven approach, and I went out to Silicon Valley and joined Intuit. When I was at Intuit, I stayed there 8 years. I could only see, do I want to go product management, or do I want to go a little deeper into this thing called innovation, right? Didn't know that chief innovation officer was in the future, right? It could have been, sure. And so I chose to drive innovation and go deeper in innovation. And so for me, I would tell that person, think about the next experience you want to have, not necessarily the next company, not necessarily the next role, but what's the next experience you would want to have? That would probably be one thing. I think the second thing I would probably tell that person is, it may seem that everybody's job and their patterns of jobs, and you either pick that path or this path. The reality is they're all unique, and be okay with that. And so for me, my path was, I started in technology, right? Engineering and whatnot. And you can almost think of it as feasibility. I went to business school, and that was viability. I went to Intuit, a customer-driven approach, and that was desirability. And now I've got depth in each of those three that I can apply in any situation, whether it's chief innovation officer, consultant, or anything else. And so as much as it seems like there are set paths, I will tell you, I didn't have a path, but when I look back, it sure does sound like it was a good path. And so again, if I couldn't be a World Cup soccer player, I guess this isn't so bad.
That's fair. Well, Scott, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate all the insights. I'd like to take a minute to ask the audience to activate your video now. Take a minute to go through the gallery and scroll through, see everyone who came to the event today. So we're glad to have had you. And we'll be posting this webcast to YouTube and sending the link along. So we'll be sure to send out that recap. And then finally, our next Off the Record, this next week, we're going to be hosting Mark Gorlin, who's the founder and CEO of Roadie, to talk about the future of logistics. Look forward to seeing everyone there. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Robert.
Take care.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Scott.
Robert.